and welcome to the convened by the British Chamber of Commerce in Thailand. My name is Stephen Frost. I'm chair of the British Chamber Legal and Taxation Group, and I will be moderating the event this afternoon. This event is the third in a series of 4 linked events based all on the Personal Data Protection Act, which, as I'm sure you will know, is due to come into effect at the end of May this year, only a short time ahead. The title of the event is Practical Implementation of the Personal Data Protection Act Compliance Measures. It's going to be divided into 6 parts in accordance with the flyer for the event. That is consent management, privacy notices, Personal Data Protection Act records of processing activities, data incident management, data subject rights request management, and grandfathering provisions under Section 95 of the Act. We have 3 guest speakers for you this afternoon, and I'll summarize their CVs. They are the same speakers who've spoken already at the first and second events in this series. Kun Artista, otherwise Kunot Chitrana Kro, is a partner and director of Tilakey and Gibbons Corporate and Commercial Group and joint head of the firm's Regional Technology Industry Group. She regularly advises clients across industries on a wide range of technology matters, including data protection, cybersecurity, fintech, reg tech, multinational and local technology industry clients on a range of strategic matters, and these will include market entry, M&A transactions, and regulatory compliance across Southeast Asia. Kunob is a Certified Information Privacy Professional Asia, CIPP/A, with International Association of Privacy Professionals. She also serves as an advisory board member of Insurtech Asia and is Tilakey and Gibbons representative to the Thai FinTech Association. She is ranked as a leading technology industry lawyer in Thailand by Chambers Asia Pacific and Next Generation Partner -TMT for the Legal 500 Directory of Lawyers. She was named as one of Asia's top 40 lawyers aged under 40 by Thomson Reuters Asian Legal Business, and last year in 2020 she was nominated for the Data Privacy Lawyer of the Year Award for Asia at the Asian Legal Awards. Our second speaker this afternoon is Kun Tanwa Mahil. I'm going to leave the second name. I'm sorry, Tanwa, I need to practice that more. Who is a partner in the Legal and Tax Services Division of Grant Thornton. Kun Tanwa is a US-trained lawyer and has been advising clients in Thailand since 2004, some 17 years ago. He's advised and assisted clients on corporate and commercial matters, including foreign investment planning, corporate structuring, business acquisitions, joint venture formations, and commercial contracts. Kun Tanwa has also assisted clients in carrying out corporate legal due diligence reviews on Thai companies in the context of M&A transactions and preparations for IPOs of foreign parent companies listing in Malaysia and also on the Hong Kong stock exchanges. Kun Tanwa advised Thai clients on foreign investment planning and corporate structuring projects, including investment tax privilege planning, corporate formation and structuring for foreign businesses, capitalization and capital expatriation and repatriation. Since 2019, supported by the Grant Thornton UK teams, specialising in general data protection regulation advisory work, Canwa has been actively advising clients on matters relating to personal data protection and data privacy matters under the PDPA in Thailand. He's also written articles on implementation issues relating to the PDPA and has also spoken at seminars and workshops on this subject. Our third guest speaker this afternoon is Kun Tanwa's colleague, Kun Benjawan Pinjirapong, who's an associate director in the management consulting division at Grant Thornton. Kun Benjawan has over 15 years of experience in retailing, trade, manufacturing, financial securities, and insurance businesses. Her expertise encompasses business process improvement, finance process transformation, change management, and project management. Prior to joining Grant Thornton, she was the management consulting manager at Accenture, the performance improvement manager at Ernst & Young Advisory Services, the performance and budget controller at SCB Bank, the accounting manager at Agoda Services, and also an auditor at Ernst & Young in Thailand. So those are our three speakers. If you wish to ask questions, please go to the button which is on the at the foot of your personal computer and type in your questions there. We will go with the three speakers first of all, and then come to questions and answers afterwards. Thank you very much, and over to you, distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for the introduction. So today I would like to recap again that the third session is going to be jointly presented by Grant Thornton and myself from Flicking Gibbons. So this session is going to be something that is a little bit more deep dive, if that's the word. So we will be talking about the practical issue and also the suggested recommendation, both from the experience from Flicking Gibbons as we are a law firm, and also from Grant Thornton in the aspect of technology solutions. So as Stephen has mentioned, we have selected about 5 to 6 topics to go through. And in terms of the house rule, I think it would be more informative if I will start talking about the topic first. And of course, also talking about what are our recommendations in terms of our experience in helping our clients for compliance with the PDPA. And then later on, I will pass the floor to Grant Thornton for Kun Tanwa or Kun Ben to maybe perhaps chip in some of their comments and some of the useful insight that they would want to contribute to help the audience to understand a bit more that on the technology solution side, is there any other things that will be helpful or make things or life easier for the businesses for them to be able to comply with the PDPA? First of all, we would like to talk about the best practice for the consent requirements. I think from our experience, the first thing that we always and keep telling our clients is that even though the law said that you need to get consent for processing personal data, unless you have any other exemptions would allow you otherwise. But in fact, and in reality, what we always recommend to our clients is that consent is not the king. So it means that you need to explore any other alternatives or other legal ways to identify whether or not you really need to get consent as the lawful basis to collect and process personal data. So the key question that you need to be consider is, when must we have consent? And the answer is, you must already have identified that for each processing activity. You cannot rely on any other lawful basis, such as, for example, legitimate interest or contractual necessity or legal obligation. If you cannot rely on those other lawful bases, then you will need to explore relying on consent as the last resort. And the problem that we have been getting a lot from the client is how to get consent. Does it have to be in writing always, or can it be just a nod? Or if, for example, we have clients that actually doing a lot of telesales, like outbound call for selling their service and product, how do you get consent? So our answer in a nutshell is that you have to, first of all, go back to the requirement under the law first, that the request for consent, it has to be in writing or it is via electronic means. So it means you have to do it in writing, or maybe perhaps if you are transacting online, you can do it like an online form too. But if when it comes to the mode of communication that cannot be done in writing or cannot be done online or through digital transactions, for example, telemarketing, actually the law also allows you to get the consent over the phone call, and also you need to implement appropriate measure to make sure that you collect consent, the verbal consent, and also record it for future reference. So it is possible that you can get consent with during the call that you are having with your customer, and then there is a process that you record the conversation. So make sure that when it comes to a complaint, or if the data subject has any question about whether or not he or she has really given consent to you, then you have the evidence to refer back. So in a nutshell, it means that you can do it in a writing, or you can do it by online transaction, or you can even do it by recording over the phone. Another thing that you need to be mindful when drafting what is called a request for consent is that everybody would want to have a catch-all type of consent request, which would enable you to use personal data at any type of activity that you would want to do. But it is because that catch-all type of request for consent or consent form is actually against the principle under the PDPA. So you need to be mindful that in the future, the PDPC, who is the regulator that is entrusted to ensure the enforcement of the PDPA, will issue what is called a negative list, or the type of consent or request for consent that will not be acceptable under the PDPA. So when you are going to draft or come up with your consent form, be mindful and go through the list. One, it is issued by the PDPC, that maybe perhaps your consent language cannot be catch-all. Another question that we get a lot from the client is that, do we need to do a consent form in Thai? Can it be just in English? Just so you know that actually the law does not say that the consent form or the request for consent must be in Thai. So technically it means that you can actually do it in English, and by doing so without a Thai translation, it will not be against the law. But the problem is that because under Thai law, when you request for consent, there is a requirement that the language to request for consent must be easy to understand, must be in plain language. So if you normally communicate with your clients who understand and can communicate well in English, and you choose to have a consent form in English, that should be acceptable. But if, for example, you normally communicate with your clients in Thai, and everything else except for the consent form actually are made in Thai, and then if you want to roll out your consent form in English, maybe perhaps for convenience wise, it could expose you to this possibility of complaint from the customer or from the data subject that your request for consent or the consent form is not used in plain language. It cannot be easy to understand, and the consent that you have obtained from such individual will become invalid. And another key issue that you need to be mindful is when requesting for consent or when obtaining consent. The problem all the time is that consent must be freely given. And the problem that we have heard a lot is when, for example, there is an imbalance of power relationship between the controller and the data subject. The consent that has been given because of that imbalance in power of the relationship, for example, from employee to employer, can be found invalid as well. And before I pass this to Grant Thornton, there is another thing that I would like to also mention about is about the Thai National Identification Card that provide sensitive data such as religions and blood type. There has been a lot of discussions about it because actually those set of sensitive data are not just regular or general personal data that you will require explicit consent. Just another update for you to when you want to roll out your how should I say it? When you want to roll out your measure to make sure that you comply with the PDPA before 1st of June, I think you can wait to roll out the measure that will help you to close this gap of getting explicit consent if you collect a copy of ID card. It is just because PDPC has informed it at the public hearing session that they know that the sensitive data on the identification card is actually a national issue, and it is a nationwide problem that the PDPC will issue a subordinate guideline or further clarification on what will be the recommended approach in terms of collecting sensitive personal data from the ID card. So in a nutshell, if you need to roll out some measure and if you have to allocate some of the budget to make sure that you comply with the explicit consent requirement from the ID card collection, I would recommend you to wait for further clarification from the regulator before starting to implement anything that will require substantial money or substantial effort from your team member. And with that, I will pass this to Grant Thornton to perhaps talk about their recommendation and their insights and their useful experience.
Thank you, Kuno. So if I will trouble you to go to the next slide.
Sure.
Thank you. So just for our audience, in the matter of consent, as you have heard from Kuno Tilaki, there are several legal dimensions and complications that you have to go through. Let's just say that now, once you have drafted, you have the consent letters, you have your disclaimers, the next step is how do you deploy it, right? For example, you have customers or viewers coming into your company or your organization's website, or if you're selling services through applications, or even HR, you're collecting information on applicants who are coming in to apply for work. How do you deploy it? Obviously, traditionally, it's a piece of paper, but hard copies are very hard to control, which the PDPA also requires the data controller, your organizations, to keep track of. Right? So from the technical dimension, there are some systems that are available. For instance, based on our review in Thailand, the first slide that you see on the top, OneTrust, TrustArc, and Osano, these are some of the systems that companies in Thailand have adopted. The other systems are not as widely adopted. Those are used in other countries. Just to give you an idea, for example, once you have the consent letter, you have the language. Obviously, when you visit somebody's website, you see that there's a pop-up window, right? And you could go in and opt in and out in terms of giving as the customer or the public member of the public, your consent over various elements that the company or the organization is collecting your personal data. So these systems would provide you with the engine through an API to connect to your internal database to collect and also keep track on each customer's or each data subject's preferences. Okay, so there's that technical dimension in terms of how do you collect it. If you could go to the next slide, Kuno. Just to give you an overview, these are just some systems that we are aware. On the left-hand side, you would see that these are all the elements of what the systems can perform or can provide. These are things that your IT department or your compliance personnel with respect to PDPA has to consider, right? Some systems don't have all the elements that you may need. Obviously, there's a cost and benefit analysis. In a perfect world, we'll pay for the most expensive system with all the options and bells and whistles, but in reality, that's not possible. So one thing that you need to do as an organization is to review from a cost and benefit perspective and a risk perspective, what makes sense commercially for you to invest in. For certain elements, you might just impose a policy and have an internal auditing process to keep track to see whether people actually implement it. Obviously, the best solution is that a solution that locks the user or your own personnel at the access level. So for example, if you look at, these are some of the examples of various systems. And you can see what they are capable of. So these are the elements: case management, complaint classification. For example, if somebody, a data subject, complained to your organization saying that, hey, I received an unsolicited email, please take me off that list. Can your system actually classify, keep track of all these complaints, right? Or are you using manual human resources to keep track of it? If you don't have a lot of data, it might not make sense for you to invest in a system. But if you're dealing with thousands and tens of thousands of data, you probably will need to invest, right? Customer complaint tracking, do you have that? Is there a feedback system? The forms, as Kuno has mentioned, there might be revisions. The authorities might come up with a list that says certain languages cannot be used, certain types of overly broad consent materials cannot be used, and you have many versions of your form. Can you keep track of version A, B, C of those consent management? So all these system elements that when you choose to invest, you have to consider. Other matters in terms of, I think we'll go into it later on, data breach management, usage tracking capabilities are also to be considered. Obviously, no one system would be able to do everything unless you really invest into a very state-of-the-art system. You may have to plug and play different elements and consider from a cost and benefits perspective what different elements to incorporate into your company. Okay, so why don't we go ahead, Kuno, on your part? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, and now we turn to another, I think it's a hot topic, or we call it a hot pin for all the businesses to understand, like, what exactly is the privacy policy, privacy notice, and what needs to be done, right? Just to recap, like, it is a requirement under the law that when you collect the personal data from the data subject, either before or at the collection, you need to give out certain information that will be that's actually a list of required under the PDPA. So that's normally what we would help to come up with what is called a privacy notice. So it is like a template or an already drafted documentation that will help you to also give or notify the data subject in order to comply with the notification requirement. So most of the time, we have helped quite a number of people to come up with that template. But about the way of giving that notification, it can be, of course, done like traditionally by you just hand it over or send a link or just send a QR code. But in terms of how do you, how should I say, make an evidence that you have already supplied or notified the privacy notice is another thing that I believe Grant Thornton will be able to explain a little bit more on what will be the technology solution that will help you to keep log of all those notifications that you have done. In terms of the other minor issues, practical issues that we get from the clients all the time is that, can privacy policy be like just one template and then you can use from all type of data subject you have? Like for example, when we do the gap analysis for our clients, most of the time it is not just only one type of the data subject that you are involved in. But the problem is that if you have like one template of privacy policy or privacy notice that will be given to any data subject that you will want to, that documentation will be super lengthy. Like for example, we see that in one in one organization, there'll be around 4 types of data subject, and you should normally have 4 templates of privacy notice to be given to each specific type of the data subject. So imagine that you have like 10 documents per one template, and you combine it into 4 into one single document. It will be a 40 pages document, and it makes people being lost in all of the information, and that will not satisfy the requirement under the PDPA that you need to give the information sufficiently and easily to understand enough so that the data subject will be able to understand the consequence of giving or not giving the personal data. So having 40 pages privacy notice for any type of data subject is not recommended by us. And another thing is about, again, same question, can it be in Thai or must it be in Thai? Again, if your mode of communication with your customer or your employee or your relevant data subject is always in English, then it does not hurt to have it in English as well. But if you normally talk to your clients, if you normally communicate with your employee in Thai, then it will be very awkward and it will be hard for you to justify why are you going to only have the privacy notice in English. And then it will be difficult for you to be able to demonstrate that the information that's provided to the data subject would be actually understandable for the data subject. And another thing that we get a lot of queries from the client is that what if we want to give we want to serve the privacy notice like on the website or on the application and everything? Does it have to be like 12 pages and then you have to scroll down and read through everything and click I have received and read and understand everything? Actually, you don't need to do it. You can just give it by giving a link or even a QR code that will help the data subject to add their preference to click on the link and then go through the privacy policy or the content of privacy policy the way that they want to do. Another million-dollar question is that how much detail you need to put in, right? According to the guideline from the PDPC, the details of the privacy notice or privacy policy, you need to make sure that the information that's provided is sufficiently enough for the data subject or for the customer or for your employee to being able to consider and understand and come up with the consequence of giving personal data to you. If the information that is provided would not be able to help the data subject to understand what would be the consequence of giving or not giving personal data, then the details or the information that you are provided in the privacy notice is not sufficient. Last thing before I pass it to Grant Thornton is if you want to change privacy notice, what to do, right? Because most of the time, sometimes you want to update it, sometimes you want to change it. If you want to change the privacy notice in the future, and if I think it is like a golden rule that if it changes the purpose that you process the personal data, or if the change could adversely impact the data subject, you will need to notify it. And most of the time, you will need to get consent for the change of purpose of processing personal data from the customer or from the data subject before you can roll out the newer versions of your privacy policy. And with that, I pass this to Kun Tanwa again.
Yeah, actually, Kunal, I think the privacy part, in terms of the technology and the system part, is not too different from the requirements for consent in terms of the technology deployment. In interest of time, perhaps you should go into the data breach.
Sure.
I think that would be something we have more to add on. Yeah.
Yes. So I think for data breach, I'll speak less and then let's have Kun Thanwa talk and Kun Ben talk a lot about it, because in terms of data breach, actually for the legal advisory part, we can help preparing a template of like, reporting. We can help tailoring what needs to be reported to the PDPC, what need to be notified to the data subject, and what would be the press release content that you need to do in order again to comply with the 72 hours requirements of the reporting. But I think I would be very interested to hear from Kun Thanwa and also Kun Ben if you would be able to share some experience. What would be technology solution that would help for the clients or for the business to be able to achieve these like hurdles or this burden of notifying within 72 hours under the PDPA?
Yeah. Okay. So I think from the data breach, in terms of a standard, that there is a international standard that would be able to assist companies, the ISO 27001, which goes towards the best management practices for data management, information security management. There are several elements, and I understand that for our Thai PDPA purposes, the guidelines are still quite minimal. But the general view is that if you apply and adhere to the ISO standards, you should have the security system in place that would allow you to pass muster in terms of the PDPA. So in terms of the elements, obviously there is a security element. There is then the breach reporting element, user access, restrictions, everything that you would have imposed into it, including monitoring under the ISO standards. Now, in terms of data breach reporting, again, when we come back to our system, it goes towards how the level that your system can report and assess the threat that has occurred. Obviously, if it's a manual system and the number of hours that you need to report back to the authorities, 72 hours, I doubt you would be able to do so. But from a system basis, a system that is compliant with the ISO standard should be able to provide you with a report in terms of when the breach occurred, at what site, or what in terms of what location, which user access, including any breach in terms of your own internal users breach of policy. For instance, certain information, the PDPA requires that a company, when it collects data, only shares it with certain entities that's disclosed or used in a certain way. Obviously, it's very difficult for us in this day and age to track in terms of how staff would be emailing or sending information outside the organization. Obviously, you can have a system that tracks the emails of staff, but that is a very passive way of controlling, because they would have done it, breached, and then you realize that they have breached, and then you come and assess through the mail filters in terms of, okay, person A, when did they send what information on what day. Now, a more active way would be that certain informations require authorizations or encryptions, and certain data cannot be easily moved from the server, so they can't copy it and just copy and paste into the email system. and also disabling access in terms of computers, peripherals, USB drives, thumb drives, plug and play hard drives that they can't take away the information. So that's the more active part in terms of how your system could prevent a data breach. I think, Kun Ben, do you want to share a bit on the matrix that we have? I think if in the more technical part, that might be more helpful.
Okay, let me share.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see the screen?
It takes a moment. Okay, so in this, and I apologize for the Excel, it's a bit small, people can't see it. What you would see is we have the different elements mapping out what systems can or cannot do. For example, what OneTrust, what can it do, or what functions does it not have? And on the left-hand side, you would see the various elements that we are trying to comply with the PDPA. So if we go down, then in terms of access management and threat protections.
Is that sorry?
Yeah. Down.
Can you
yeah,
see?
here we go. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, information protection. So information protection, and now we're getting into more technical matters. For instance, when you collect data, how do you make sure that it is safe, right? From a security part, you're active in trying to prevent the breach, or even if somebody hacked into your system and tried to obtain the information, they cannot easily get access to the underlying data. So Ben, could you scroll down a little bit more? One more row. So it says information protection. There we go. So, you know, we've all heard of encryption. So there are various technologies using encryption. Encryption is not the means to an end as well. There's also other techniques. For example, here, you know, masking techniques such as substitution shuffling. All that does is it's smoke and mirrors. Okay, so for example, if you have information that's personal to someone, at each variable in that information, you will substitute out another letter and another number, so that whoever has access to that information cannot get to the real data. For example, my address, right? You might have substitution going in at various parts of the address, whereby instead of the street number, certain letters would be used, and there's no way that somebody who eventually hacked into your system get that information will be able to make sense of it. Shuffling is just shuffling the information in random matters. Obviously, somebody with a key would that only somebody with a key would be able to unshuffle it and make sense of the information. So these are some of the technologies, right, that you would have. In terms of breach, if we go down to the lower part, threat protection and complaint management. Okay, in terms of threat protection, obviously most systems, most organizations would have antivirus, spam filters, malware filters. How capable they are depends on the system, and it's hard for us to say which is better than another. Obviously, all of them have the different elements, whether they can detect certain malwares coming into your system. Are they capable of alerting your IT department? Can the technology eliminate them? So automatically it will just dispose of those spam mails or malware coming in, right? And even if there is a breach, is there an effective quarantine, right? Nowadays in our COVID-19 world, we are very familiar with the word quarantine. So if certain computers or certain systems in your organizations are infected, does the system that you deploy have the capability of building firewalls to limit the exposure and access. In terms of complaint management, again, once there is a breach, and I think this one goes to both complaint in terms of customer complaints, but it also applies to breach management. If something happens, usually the process for reporting is quite manual. Technologies can't really go through in terms of who would do what once a breach occurs. So at that level, you would need to have robust policies. Obviously, you need to have training. If you have DPOs, it may help if somebody is well trained in the process to update the different personnel and management on what are the steps that you would need. So that would shorten down the lead time of confusion in terms of trying to figure out what needs to be done. Kun Ben, if you have anything to add, let me know.
Yeah, just would like to add more. Everything that we just mentioned is about to prevent and to protect the database. But actually, there are some technology or application that help once someone stole your information, maybe through thumb drive. We have like application that plug in with the information that we classify as sensitive information. Once they open the file using the USB that copy information from our system, they cannot log in, they cannot open the file. They may require to input the password, or they need to put more identity or any other thing to prove that they are authorized. And you can also set in the application that if using the user who have that information can only open that information using our company device. So that is another way to protect the database, to protect our information from the person who stole information from our company.
Okay, and we'll pass it back to you, Kuno. Ben, I think you need to stop sharing first.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I think Grant Thornton has already covered this part about the data subject price request and management, right? So I'll skip this one because I think from the legal point of view, what we can do is really to make sure that when the request is made, then you know, you actually already analyze whether or not the request is legitimate, or do you need to really respond to the request as made by the data subject. So I think the legal part and also the technology part can play a very crucial roles in terms of making sure that when do you need to respond and how do you need to respond, how do you log it, and how do you keep the record if you have responded or what you have responded. And then I'm going to move on to the very last topic. It is very about the grandfather provision, which in a nutshell, this section say that when the law becomes implemented or fully effective, which is 1st of June this year, the data for the personal data that you have collected and used before the 1st of June, you can continue to use it, but you need to make sure that you have implemented a measure that would allow the data subject or your customer or your employer to be able to opt out easily or to easily withdraw his or and in a short name, we call it notice under section 95 to first of all, what is it? Establishing an evidence that you are communicating to the data subject that you are collecting this certain type of data of this data subject before the implementation date of the PDPA. And then you also notify the original purpose or the practice that you are doing for the personal data of your customer, just to again establish the evidence that this is the set of information that businesses got from the customer, and these are the original purpose of processing of personal data. And then you also tell your customer what would be the method of opting out the consent if he or she would want to after 1st June. And then last but not least, then you can also ask the customer or the data subject to, if you object with the way that we are currently using or processing your personal data, then please get back to us. And again, this is to set the evidence that you have been collecting and using this information, this personal information, before 1st of June. And these are the purpose set out in the privacy policy that you have been using. And it is the original purpose before the PDPA is implemented. And you also notify what will be the method of opt-out. This is to, again, setting up the evidence and also complying with the requirement under Section 95 to ensure that you have rolled out the measure and publicize the measure to allow the personal to allow the data subject to opt out his or her consent when he or she would want to after the implementation date of the PDPA, which is 1st of June. And this is actually a sample of one of the company that we have seen. It is a notice under 95 in English and in Thai. It's set out what we have explained. And actually this one has been published even before the PDPA got extended for another year. It's just a sample that we want to tell you that for the businesses, even though it is not compulsory and even you don't do it, it's not against the law, but we would recommend you to do it, as well as other businesses that have been taking this approach, just to make sure that when the law is implemented, you don't have to fight with your customer, you don't have to fight with the data subject, that whether or not this set of information you have been holding it before the date of PDPA, what are the original purpose that would justify you to continue to use personal data after the implementation of the PDPA. And with that, that's actually the last tip that I have. I'll pass this to Thornton before we open the floor for Q&A.
Thank you. No, I think for this part, there are two elements. First is, before coming into June of this month, that means organizations and companies must already have started the process of identifying the information they have on hand and match it to the individuals, and also track against their contact so that you can contact them, the company can contact them to reobtain to give the data subject the chance to opt out, essentially, of the company's continuing use. The challenge there, from what we've seen, is before this time, information might have been stored in all sorts of manner. Some of it is in hard copies, some of it is in soft copies, in Excel, and then they port it over to another system. So that is generally the challenge for companies. So I think different organizations would have different levels of challenges. Obviously, if the organization has already implemented a standardization of data storage and collection, it will be much simpler for them to deploy this. It goes back again to the system that you would use at the consent end. Once you identify the data subjects that would be grandfathered, you need to refresh the consent and start recapturing their information and their allowances in terms of what they would grant the organization the right to use. Kun Ben, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just would like to add a case study that we used to help clients before. They have limited budget to invest in technology, but we help clients to work around so they can save budget, and they can also implement the technology that they currently have to help as well. This can apply in every step, the 7 steps that I ever mentioned about last week. but except for the consent. In terms of consent, actually we can use in-house system that developed by our IT to help. And anyway, it's up on the list and the impact that we assess with the management and the company. And sometimes, okay, yeah, okay. Sometimes you may be able to use or utilize your current system like the ERP that you currently use to help in the consents as well. And the short test period that we ever help client to implement technology to help in consent stage is about 2 to 4 weeks, because we use like application that can just plug in or just API the information from the application to the ERP or the system that they currently use right now. That was all the information that I just would like to share from our experience with client.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So any last thing that you want to tell to the floor before we pass this back to Stephen for the Q&A sessions? Anything else?
Nothing for us right now. So I think we'll put the questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So with that, Stephen, we pass this back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a most interesting and fascinating presentation. We have one question that has come up from Andrew Stoutley of Tillicky and Gibbons. His question is, if staff use their own line account to contact customers or indeed clients, would this be a breach of the Act? And how could such conduct of employees be stopped or prevented? Over to the panel.
Do you want to go first, Kuntanwa?
I'm inclined to think what's pragmatic as opposed to what's a zero risk answer from management. If it's a zero risk answer, it's like stop using social media. But we know that that is almost impossible. So first we have to consider what information is being shared online. The elements, because this act, we must remember, does not apply to everything. It applies to only data that can identify that other person. So if I have a line profile, perhaps it has my photo, but it might not have my number. It has my line ID that you have contacted me. My assumption is that when you add me as a friend, there is a certain kind of implied consent to be contacted. Now, if for example, then I proceed to use those information, the amounts of friends I've amassed online to set up my own business, to sell, I don't know, to sell ice cream to all my contacts. Is that an invasion on privacy to use their contact? The question is, at that point, what is the liability of the organization that has provided or through whom I have obtained the information? My inclination is that it doesn't arise to a level of personal data that would impose a high level of risk on the organization. Partially because when I obtain the information from the other person, it's almost like a personal, you're exchanging name cards type of deal. So that's my knee-jerk response. Kunal, from a legal perspective.
Yeah, actually, when I get this question, right, it reminds me of what we have been asked by one of our clients, that actually it's about the use of office mobile device, and then there's an application, and then employee like me was chit-chatting about things about myself, and then talking about Andrew, and also talking about Kuntanwa as well. And then the question from the client was asking, which is quite interesting, is that because this is the company mobile device, right? So technically, the first reaction from the employer would mean that whatever is in that mobile phone belong to the employers. So the interesting case is that because the question was asked from a GDPR country, so that's why they were using their own standard, right? And then they're saying that in Germany, actually, if the employer would want to do what is called a screening or would want to scan through the mobile device, and even that mobile device is belong to the employer itself, the requirement under the GDPR, which is of course the stems of the law that we have been using to roll out or to implement PDPA, is that there must be a process from the employer to make sure that you have to force the employee to not using the mobile device for personal use first before you are able to, as an employer, to scan through the information within that the mobile device. So that is a measure that the law said that even though we have the perception that everything belongs to the company, right? So the law from the more enhanced jurisdiction say that privacy rights is also important as well. So even it is like the computer, the laptop of the employer, the mobile device of the employer, that you as an employer, you have to roll out certain measure that will make sure that the personal data or personal information of the employees are all out. And what is left in the mobile device or the laptop has to be employees related data or work related data. It's interesting to be see, right, if this kind of like situation is rolled out in Thailand and once PDPA become more mature, whether or not my conversation talking about Puntanwa on Telecom mobile phone will need to be carved out or deleted out or taken out first before my employer will be able to do a scan on the mobile device. I'm not sure if this like really directly to what Andrew has asked, but I think it's very interesting to share.
If I could possibly come in there, it seems to me on this specific point of Andrew Stoutley, I think it may be the case that companies will have to look at possibly adding an additional clause into standard contracts of employment to ensure that employees observe the provisions of the PDPA and do not leak or disclose personal data.
Do we have any other question from the audience?
Yeah, and I'm on mute, aren't I? Okay. Yes, Andrew Stoutley has raised a second question, and it's a more general point. How will the authorities monitor and enforce the requirements of the PDPA? And it seems to me this is a very key issue. Are we going to see reactive enforcement? For example, data subjects or employees are going to complain, or are we going to see more proactive enforcement? A case where the regulator is going to appoint its own force of inspectors to monitor the requirements of the Act and that they're being complied with.
Well, I'll take this one then. I think it's quite premature to really say definitely, right? But I think it is because it's this law, the nature of it is personal data. So that means it's very important to the public, right? So even though the regulator is not like super actively enforcing this law, I believe that people in Thailand will be very actively exercising their rights in accordance with the PDPA. So it means that we foresee that there's going to be a lot of complaints, if that's the word. There will be a lot of requests, data subject right requests made to the controller. But just so you know, because I think it was in February, there was the public hearing talking about the complaint handling process that the PDPC will want to roll out if there is a complaint going to be made by the data subject. So the perceptions of the regulator already know that there will be a lot of complaints. So that's why they said that before the complaint can actually be considered by the regulator, at least the controller or the businesses and the data subject must find a way to negotiate about it, must try to settle it first before escalating the issue to the regulator. So with that perception, I believe even though the regulators would not need to actively enforce the requirements or the regulations under the PDPA, I think it will become phenomena, if that's the word, after 1st of June for seeing the people exercising a lot of rights that they have under the PDPA.
Thank you, Knop. Okay, unless there's any other comments on that, can I raise an issue, please? What concerns me somewhat is the staffing requirements that companies and employers will have to undertake in order to demonstrate that they're keeping their records accurately under the PDPA. We have some enormous companies in Thailand with very large workforces. If you think about banks and insurance companies and retailers, just one statistic, the Tesco supermarket chain has 40,000 employees. Now, it seems to me that companies like that are going to have to think of what number of people they need to recruit or indeed to train to keep and maintain records required under the Act. If you've got a workforce of 40,000 employees, that's one end of the spectrum, or it might be just a small manufacturing company, perhaps a workforce of only 50 employees, a small manufacturing operation, and perhaps only 2 or 3 customers, or 2, possibly 3 suppliers. That's the other end of the spectrum in relation to the data that is going to have to be kept and maintained. So could I ask the panelists their comments on that, staffing requirements that companies may have to undertake as a result of this Act?
I think it's a matter of costs and benefits, because I understand that the PDPA does not have a defined exact number of personnel you need to have. For example, even DPO, we have companies or the clients asking, how many DPOs do I need? And it's hard to say, how many do you need? How much data do you process? A lot of large companies might have relatively low volumes of personal data. For instance, if their business model is that it's mainly a B2B, and most of the personal data that they will collect would be internal staffing data, their own personnel, their own employees. Then at that time, they need to consider the limited nature and formats that HR is already, in a way, performing today, right? Keeping a secrecy in terms of confidentiality of personnel data. So again, I don't think there is a hard and fast answer to it. At the end of the day, I think the legal stand would be, for the management, is there some negligence? Are you being, in terms of implementing or complying with the law, have you done that which is reasonable to discharge your duty in a way that you say you've done, or what is deemed reasonable to defend yourself? The law doesn't say you cannot allow breach to occur. It's just that once a breach occurs, you have certain responsibilities to respond, to report, and to assess what happened. So again, I don't think there is a hard and fast answer to that. The organization must conduct that review internally, what makes sense on their budget and the amount of data they process.
Okay, Knop, anything on that?
Yes, I think I will concur to the recommendations of Kuntan Wai. It's very difficult to to say and also quantifying the amount of staffing, right? I think that the word that we might want to say would be the amount of resource and effort that the organization need to do to ensure that they comply with the requirement under the PDPA, right? So staffing, I think, is one thing. It is the first thing that people ask is because the law requires that you need to have a DPO, a data protection officer. So that's why we think like we need to set another unit just to make sure and keep monitoring like whether or not the organization really comply with the law. But there are so many things that will be able to help in terms of the compliance with the law. And of course, we keep talking about technology solutions, which most of the time, like what Kuntanwa has mentioned about the applications or even like like for example, OneTrust is offering a lot of features that will be able to help organization to be able to comply with without adding more staffing, if that's the word. And then another thing that you can also implement, and you don't have to hire a lot of people, but you have to make sure that the people understand the mindset of, for example, data minimization. So if you have like not much, if the quantity of the information, the personal information is as little as it is possible, then the governance or the monitoring or the resource that will be required to ensure that you need to comply with the PDPA is a lot far less than if you have like a large chunk of personal data sitting everywhere. So I think it is very surrounding, not just staffing, it's about resource and about preventive measure that you have just to make sure that you implement the right approach and you limit your exposure by, for example, not having too much type of personal information deleted when you don't use it, and you only collect the information that you need or necessity for the purpose of processing it. So that will help a lot, and I think it is something that you have to consider in conjunction with the staffing that you need to employ or the IT solution that you need to deploy just to be able to comply with the PDPA. I think one last thing before the next question for me that I want to say is, if you don't have personal data, that means you are out of the requirement under Personal Data Protection Act. That's it.
Okay, two further questions have just come in. They are linked. The first from Thomas Rippon. It seems that the consent requirements relate to data controllers. Now, if we are a data processor, do we need to take any action regarding consent, or can we continue processing data as usual? So that's about what are the obligations of a data processor are. And the second question related to this is, could you clarify the requirements for data controllers and data processors, please?
I think we need another session for that, to be honest. The first question I would take then, well, it's about consent requirements and whether or not data processor will need to take any actions regarding the consent, right? So I think we have to take one step back to understand first that the data processor is the one who is acting on behalf of or under the instructions of the controller. So without the controller, you don't have the processor. So it means that the obligation to establish the lawful basis rests with the controller. So if we are talking about consent as the lawful basis for collecting and processing personal data, if the controller already satisfy the requirement of consent and already get consent, and then passing the information for the data processor to process the information on behalf of the controller, there's nothing else that controller need to do, with exceptions to make sure that complying with the instructions of the controller and make sure that the processor comply with the requirement under the PDPA. That's it. That's what the processor need to know and need to do. Do you have anything to add, Kuntanwa?
I think, yeah, we've pretty much covered that.
Okay, some more questions are coming in. The first question is about the obligations of data protection officers. The question is, does the company data protection officer need to contact the PDP committee before the 1st of June. Will the PDP committee be sending some kind of inspector or officer to contact the company instead?
I think the question is, go ahead, please, go ahead.
My understanding is that there is no requirement to contact them, nor will the committee contact the company. It's more of, you must have that person and you must start ensuring compliance if and when there is an inspection or a complaint leading to an audit or an inspection.
Kunop, anything on that?
So the only scenario that I could think of that the DPO would want to contact, but that will not be before 1st of June for sure. Maybe after 1st of June, the requirement of the controller is to inform the details of the DPO to the PDPC, and then the DPO will become the point of contact for that controller or that businesses, and then the communication will flow. Either the PDPC will come to you and want to talk a little bit about the business, or you will want to contact the PDPC for consultation if you have an issue about the compliance with the requirements of the PDPA. So that is what I can only think of right now. But if you want to contact before 1st of June, I don't think there's anything that would require you to do so if that's the way.
Okay, thank you for that. A further question coming in relating to breach. If breaches of the Act have been detected, will there be a warning first and then a request to resolve the breach within a certain period of time before the regulatory authority moves to impose a fine? So is a company going to get a grace period to put its house in order before any question of fining arises?
Well, I think for the breach notification requirement, it is quite clear that you need to notify within the required period, right, or timeline, essentially 72 hours. So if you don't meet that deadline, it's hard to tell that whether or not the regulator will be easy on you. But having said all that, because the fine is administrative fine, so if you will be able to demonstrate that you have, for example, roll out the remedial actions, try everything that you can in order to even prevent or to remediate the damage that's happened because of the breach, and you try very best to notify it within 72 hours, and when the clock is ticking, it's not the same time as start ticking, it's not the same time as the regulator thing, then the regulator has the discretion to adjust the amount of administrative fine at their own discretion. But I think essentially, if you don't comply with the reporting requirements and the 72 hours requirement, it is unfortunately considered as a breach of the law, and then that's when the fine is triggered.
Something from you, Kuntanwa?
I think just to mention that, when we talk about data breach, if I remember correctly, there's the provisions in the PDPA, it's on relates to the data controller's duties. There's just that one section, I think section 37, that talks about the 72 hours breach. And as Kuno mentioned, right now, just by the text of the principal law itself, there's nothing more. The organization, the data controller, has the obligation to report. Now, whether the committee will come up with further secondary laws or regulations in terms of how you handle that, I think that waits to be seen.
Thank you. Okay, we've run a little bit over time. There's no further questions. So unless any of our speakers have any closing thoughts to put forward.
Just one thing, a lot of questions, and I think some people have been asking many questions, very good questions, thought-provoking questions for the past year. But at the end of the day, it is a new law in Thailand. There are areas where there's just no precedent yet, and it's hard for us to say how aggressive the authorities would be, how compromising they would be. And I know this makes businesses nervous because there are criminal penalties, administrative penalties, right? But we don't know there's no safe harbor. And again, I think from the chamber's perspective, it's something that the chamber and its members could try to advocate for it. At least try to push the authorities to have more visible, more clarity on some of the more pressing matters.
Okay, we'll with that, perhaps then if I could bring the webinar to a close. With much gratitude to our guest speakers, Kun Ben, Kun Nok, Kun Tanwa. Thank you very much for the work that you prepared prior to this webinar. This is, as Kun Tanwa correctly says, a new piece of legislation. And frankly, there is a question mark as to how vigorously or perhaps non-vigorously the regulator is going to enforce the obligations under the Act. So thank you very much again to all our three guest speakers, and look forward to seeing you again at our fourth and final linked event, which will take place next week. And with that, perhaps I can leave you. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.